This is In the Loop. I'm still Christian Bryant. In today's show, we'll be talking about Twin City businesses hit hard by fires, how the film industry plans to replenish our supply of bingeable content, and we'll take a deeper look at the effects of racial trauma. But first, here's what you need to know right now. Another big step today on a slow road to reopening across the US. Today, offices in New York City were allowed to reopen with limited capacity. In DC, gyms began reopening and some restaurants began seating customers indoors. Still, many companies are choosing to keep their employees home, and nearly half of all states are reporting more coronavirus cases daily.
When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
At a weekend rally, President Trump said he asked for less testing for coronavirus, though White House officials later said that remark was tongue-in-cheek, which has led to some confusion. So, in an exclusive interview with the president today, Scripps national reporter Joe St. George asked about it straight up.
We're doing so much testing, 25 million tests. Nobody thought that.
But did you ask to slow it down?
If it did slow down, frankly, I think we're way ahead of ourselves, if you want to know the truth. We've done too good a job.
Across the country, shootings disrupted some Juneteenth celebrations over the weekend. In Charlotte, 2 people were killed and 7 others injured during an impromptu block party. 5 others were hit by cars as they tried to run away from the scene. Police said they believe multiple shooters fired off dozens of rounds into the crowd. In yet another strange sign of the times, Live Nation announced a series of concerts where you can drive up and enjoy the sounds of artists like Brad Paisley, Darius Rucker, and Nelly. The series, titled Live from the Drive-In, might not be for you if the idea of an in-car concert doesn't sound appealing. Then again, what else do you have going on? Some of the most memorable scenes from protests over the last few weeks have been the fires that erupted as demonstrations reached a fever pitch. Focusing only on the destruction is reductive, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And in this next piece, we look at how some of Minneapolis's most diverse businesses burned and how owners are planning to rebuild.
Britson's, which is a Scandinavian place where you can buy fish paste, is on the same block as a Mercado. That's what Lake Street was. What it is now is, depending on where you are, just burned. Fire trucks are still coming back to put out the hot spots from the fire. It's weeks on. And I had thought that who would break into a nondescript garage, but
Chris Montana and his wife Schnell own Du Nord Craft Spirits in Minneapolis. The distillery was one of more than 100 local businesses damaged or destroyed by fires after the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer.
I knew, I was like, that night, there was no way. There was no way we were going to survive this. We were going to get hit, and that's exactly what happened. If this would have burned through, it didn't. This is still solid, but if it had burned through, that is probably about 1,000 liters of 190, between 190 and 191 proof alcohol.
Montana doesn't yet know how much the damage will set them back, but he's already thinking about the future and whether things will ever be the same.
Well, there really isn't a place like Lake Street where you have so many businesses owned by and run by persons of color that add to the overall flavor. The deck is stacked against Lake Street or any of the areas affected by the riots coming back the way that they were.
Du Nord is on the same block as the 3rd Police Precinct. The station was the epicenter of the destruction that night. Over 1,500 businesses and residential buildings were damaged or destroyed. That's according to data published by the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Many of the places burned were in multicultural business corridors, where the city's white, black, Asian, and Hispanic populations overlap. Rebuilding could take years, according to Mark Kolda of the Insurance Federation of Minnesota.
Member companies that we've talked to have said they've already paid claims. We're only a few weeks into this and there's already been checks cut. So we do know that people are getting their money. But the bigger question is, how do you rebuild in that area? You could drive the 6 miles and you could see signs in 10 different languages. And so, you hope that it returns in that sort of manner.
Kolda estimates the losses covered by insurance at about $100 million. Even for businesses with insurance, there may be no buildings left to return to. And after being hit hard by the COVID shutdown, many businesses simply will not be able to bounce back.
For the business owners of color that I've talked to, I'd say the majority of them have no expectation that insurance is going to cover all their losses. And many of them carried no insurance. And there are reasons for that. When you're undercapitalized, which typically the businesses started by persons of color have a tendency to be undercapitalized for lack of access to traditional capital, you got to make choices. And so I don't expect that insurance will do much of anything for those folks.
What took place in the Twin Cities has happened before. LA burned after the beating of Rodney King in 1991. Riots shook D.C. after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In D.C., promised government investment didn't appear for decades. When it finally came, it sparked rapid gentrification.
And so large swaths of the central business districts in almost every Black community in the city were burned to the ground. What you had essentially were cleared land and no money to put anything back on it. So you really don't see any sustained outside investment until the city begins to gentrify in a really significant way in the late 90s and early 2000s.
He said, unlike D.C., Minneapolis and Minnesota have the political will today to put money into rebuilding. City and state politicians are discussing programs to offer funding for affected business owners.
As we look at what it looks to invest in a cleanup, invest in businesses opening back up, to make sure that gentrification of those communities does not happen in a large number.
You have government that is trying to engage in the conversation, if you have businesses that are trying to engage in the conversation, and if you have a population that's trying to engage in the conversation, something's going to happen.
What is exactly happening right now?
Well, right now we're in the middle of a food bank.
After the fires, Montana and his wife turned their warehouse into a community food pantry, and the neighborhood has rallied to support business owners too.
Once the money is figured out and the drywall's ripped out and put back up, I mean, there's still going to be another Black man dead for no good reason, and that's what's going to stick with me. Hell, even if the Nordcraft Spirits as a business was erased from the face of this planet, if what that meant was the conversation would change and some real changes would be made, then that's absolutely worth it.
Mark Fahey, Newsy, Washington.
When you're back, we're looking into how show business is getting back in business.
As coronavirus spreads across the country, you might be looking for ways to make sense of it all. Newsy is here to help with some deeper context, explaining and reporting on the pandemic. Virology, only on Newsy. Be informed, not influenced.
Miss getting email that isn't junk? You should know about Newsy's daily newsletter. It's breaking news right to your inbox. Get caught up quick with the best Newsy stories every day. Join us at signup.newsy.com. Be informed, not influenced.
Y'all know what time it is. We're going to hang out in the trending topics column for a bit and see if we can peel back the layers on what's got people chirping on Twitter. New York's Museum of Natural History is removing a statue of President Theodore Roosevelt that stood outside its doors for 80 years. But it's less about the man and more about the statue itself, which shows Roosevelt seated on a horse above a Native American on one side and an African man on the other. Teddy Roosevelt was an unusually progressive president for his time, and that's part of the reason why his great-grandson, 77-year-old Teddy Roosevelt IV, is supporting the statue's removal and basically saying his ancestor wouldn't have liked it anyway, writing, "The world does not need statues, relics of another age that reflect neither the values of the person they intend to honor nor the values of equality and justice." Hashtag I Stand With Bubba is trending after a noose was found in the garage stall of Bubba Wallace, the only Black driver in NASCAR's highest level of racing. Racists gonna racist in racing, I guess. Wallace has been pretty vocal in recent weeks, supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and protests for racial justice. He was even a part of discussions with NASCAR leadership to ultimately ban the Confederate flag at races.
I am proud of NASCAR for stepping up to the plate and delivering in a huge way,
which prompted responses like this. The FBI said Monday that they are investigating the incident. If you run across names like Min Min and Sakurai on Twitter today, just know it's gaming stuff.
はい、おはようございます。
This cheery fellow who's figuring out which camera to look at is Masahiro Sakurai, the video game director for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. He announced a new playable character in the highly popular game this morning from his home, which seems pretty normal considering. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is the second best-selling game on the Nintendo Switch, a device that's probably helped a lot of us get through the pandemic. Bad news, folks. Netflix isn't just an endless fountain of bingeable shows and movies. At some point, people actually have to make all this content. And for the last few months, thousands of TV and film productions have been on hold due to the pandemic. Casey Mendoza digs into how the industry is taking some super careful steps back into the spotlight.
As many states are reopening with restrictions, the entertainment industry is making moves to do the same with film and TV productions.
I do feel safe going back. I will take my precautions for my own personal safety, but also want to ensure that everybody else that comes back feels comfortable and is as safe as they can be too.
Earlier this month, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers published guidelines for on-set COVID-19 safety. They include recommendations to hire a designated COVID-19 compliance officer, create hand-washing facilities, and supply cast and crew with personal protective equipment.
So, safety goggles, number one, a lovely bag of masks, right? They gave us a 10-pack of masks.
The guide also takes into account production-specific concerns for hairstylists, makeup artists, and actors, as well as extra sanitation guidelines for equipment. Borrow Lenses, a company that rents out camera and audio gear to entertainment workers, is consulting clients with these guidelines in mind.
Crews are going to be really, really limited. Some of the things that we're thinking about are just rethinking the way you approach basics like audio. If you're doing interviews, in person, somebody's not going to want you clipping a lav mic directly on them.
These considerations show that Hollywood is working to limit the health risk of COVID-19, but the bigger determiner for going back on set is whether studios and production companies are willing to take the financial risk. Universal is notably spending around $5 million on safety protocols to restart production on Jurassic World Dominion. The major studio project is set to be the first to start filming again, but other studios are still hesitant to get back on set.
At this point, any movie or show or anything that's going to get made is a gamble. It's a total risk that, unfortunately, if those fronting the money aren't ready to take, then it's not going to happen.
The gamble doesn't just involve the cost of adding safety precautions, it's also the cost of insurance.
That's when I think somebody realized, oh, wow, okay, this is a bigger risk than we thought. It's a bigger gamble than we thought. And so I think that's what ultimately put the brakes on the project we were thinking about.
It's little things like that. Until we actually get back out there, get back on set, and these gigs start happening again, we're going to be learning on the fly.
Casey Mendoza, Newsy, Chicago.
Just want to remind you that you can tweet at us using the hashtag NewsyInTheLoop. Feel free to hit me with comments, criticisms, but don't get foolish. And of course, pet pictures. So you've gotten tested or treated for COVID-19. Newsy wants to hear from you about how much your treatment cost. Whether your bill was big or small, share your cost of COVID story by going to newsy.com/bills.
Native women have told me that what you do when you raise a daughter is you prepare her for what to do when she's raised, not if, but when.
Why are we different than every other person? Why don't we have the justice everybody else does?
It's been hanging around for a while now, but is just now recently surging in popularity. And no, I'm not talking about kombucha, which is honestly, I'm talking about vote by mail. It's all the rage in 2020, what with the whole stay away from other people thing. But as this next story from Stephanie Liebergen shows us, voting by mail is its own unique process, and it's one that many states are trying to fine-tune.
The coronavirus changed the way Americans voted in the 2020 primaries. The biggest adjustment, voting by mail, skyrocketed. Now, states are hoping to improve the process for the November election.
The presidential primary taught us that people really like mail ballot elections.
We went from about 6% of people voting by mail to about 60% of people voting by mail.
Nebraska, Ohio, and Rhode Island saw some of the largest increases in the country, with 80 to 85% of ballots in those three states submitted by mail. There are a lot of factors that influence voter turnout, but what the 2020 primaries have shown us is that Democrats are comfortable voting by mail, and most states saw increased participation from the party's 2016 contests. But making the switch to voting by mail came with some problems.
Many of them were overwhelmed and unprepared to deal with that avalanche of requests for absentee mail voting.
In Wisconsin, over 960,000 voters cast their ballot by mail, a record high for any election in the Badger State. The entire state was under a stay-at-home order on primary day, but some voters ended up waiting in long lines because they requested an absentee ballot that never arrived. The Wisconsin Elections Commission is taking steps to avoid that problem in November.
We're implementing USPS intelligent mail barcodes. So voters and clerks will be able to track those absentee ballots from start to finish in the process.
Mail-in ballots need some kind of verification, and in the age of a pandemic, that can be an obstacle.
Historically, that oath envelope required that the signature be witnessed by two people or be notarized. For the presidential primary, we did away with that under the emergency order. And so that streamlined the process greatly. We're now proposing legislation to the General Assembly to do a similar process for the fall.
But elections officials also said they had to overcome voter misinformation, including false claims of increased voter fraud with mail-in ballots.
The positives, of course, of the higher voter participation, the fact that when you have vote by mail, it sort of creates a chicken and egg process by which voter information is better updated, et cetera. Those are typically left out of that conversation.
Now, states are looking ahead to the general election. California passed a new law requiring mail-in ballots to be automatically sent to every active registered voter for the November 2020 election. In states where people need to request a mail-in ballot, elections officials say time is on their side.
I think the hardest part of a predominantly mail ballot election is really getting the word out to voters, which is not that difficult to do if you just use every single channel available.
If we can get people who want to vote absentee to make their requests early, that's going to essentially, hopefully, flatten the curve of requests.
Stephanie Liebergen, Newsy, Miami.
I'm going to go try postage for the first time in a long time, but we'll be back in just a second.
We take a step away from the noise and spin to really hear and tell the stories that need to be told. Newsy cuts through.
We all carry baggage with us in our daily comings and goings. For many Black and brown Americans, ours is racial trauma. That can range from microaggressions to macro instances of overt racism. As Lindsay Thies explains, racial trauma is the type of baggage that can weigh on a person's mental and physical health.
Racial trauma isn't just something that Black and brown Americans experience regularly. It's something health experts say they're born into.
What makes it traumatic is how you experience it.
Similar to PTSD, racial trauma, or race-based traumatic stress, is the collective effect racism has on an individual's mental and physical health. It can be from major experiences like workplace discrimination or hate crimes, or it can be the result of an accumulation of many small indignities called microaggressions, or system or institutions that enforce structural oppression.
There was a national survey done by the American Psychological Association,
and about 25% of all African Americans, 30% of all Native Americans report at least one of those experiences at least once a week.
The APA says not only do Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American people significantly suffer from racial trauma, but that it can also compound with additional oppression based on gender or sexual orientation.
It depends on the intensity and the frequency of how often you experience racism or how severe the event is, but you might start with just race-based stress. So something will be racist and you'll be exposed to it and you'll feel stress, but racial trauma is really when it has those long-term effects. It really sticks with you.
Immediate symptoms can include increased heart rate or blood pressure, heightened cortisol levels, sweating, or tension in the body. Long-term chronic exhaustion and fatigue are among the most common symptoms.
Just sadness, underlying or overt anger, even thinking differently about yourself. So sometimes believing or starting to endorse those stereotypes that people might have about your racial group. If you're experiencing racial trauma, you might have some of that internalized racism.
Increased hypervigilance, the having the nightmares or flashbacks, avoidance of situations where they may, perceive it as threatening. All of those are consistent with what we find in race-related stress and PTSD. And so there's a lot of overlap.
Kind of, bouncing back and forth between that and numb, and never really feeling safe and socially connected and supported. And that also affects your brain and how your brain develops.
America's healthcare system impacts racial trauma too, making it more difficult not only to find help, but someone who understands a patient's experience. A 2015 study found that in the US, 86% of psychologists were white, 5% were Asian, 5% were Hispanic, 4% were Black. Meanwhile, some of the experts we spoke to are setting out to help. Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens released Black Lives Matter meditations for racial trauma victims and white allies.
Black Lives Matter.
Therapist Kelly Baker has helped organize Facebook Live videos with her local NAACP branch where anyone can connect to learn more about racial trauma. She's included sharing her own experiences.
I don't think you can say that there was ever a time for me when I did not, that I was never exposed to racism. When I think about my family, my mom, my grandmother, and the things that my mother experienced that were clearly racist definitely affected how she parented her children.
What can be done to respond to racial trauma? Dr. Erlanger Turner tells Newsy adding an official diagnosis of racial trauma to the DSM-5, an encyclopedia of sorts for mental health professionals, is not the solution. He suggests racial trauma's existence is something everyone should be aware of, especially healthcare providers and policymakers.
If you are white, you do need to make sure that you try to understand that person's experience, that you provide some sense of solidarity, that you don't apologize. I think people oftentimes want to apologize in these situations, and that's really not helpful. We need solutions. And so I think that is one of those things that we have to do better and make sure that we take ownership.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
That's it for us, and hopefully it's all downhill from here. We'll be back with more In the Loop on Tuesday, same time, same place, but don't go anywhere just yet. More top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.